Hi, this is Josh Turknett, and you're listening to Bluegrass Jam Along, the podcast for anyone and everyone who plays bluegrass.
So, my guest on Bluegrass Jam Along today is Josh Turknett, and I've been really looking forward to this chat because the way I kind of found out about Josh was his book, The Laws of Brainjo, The Art and Science of Moulding a Musical Mind, was recommended to me by Bryan Sutton. Now, that makes it sound like me and Bryan were sitting around chatting. He recommended it to all of his students, and I happen to be one of them. But I also saw a subsequent video where he said that he'd bought a copy for Sierra Hull because he thought it was so good. And I thought, well, if these two people are finding this book useful, this is something I need to read. And I did, and I absolutely loved it. And I thought it was something that'd be great to share with you guys, particularly now. As we record this, we're just heading into Christmas, which means then we're heading into New Year. And New Year is a time when a lot of people make plans to kind of change things, do more of the things they love, make some improvements in their lives. And if you are like me, a musician, every year one of your resolutions has something to do with how often you practice, how much you practice, how much you want to improve, how much you want to play with other people. So I thought it'd be a really cool time to chat to Josh about his book because it's full of great information about how to practice, but not just based on some system he's made up that he thought might sell a book, but based on how your brain actually works. There's a lot of science behind this. So I thought it'd be really cool to sort of do it now, so we've got a chance to set some real practical, realistic goals to improve next year. So Josh, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
I think it'd be great just to get a very quick bit of context from you as to why, what your background is and how you came to write this book, because it is the fact that it's a book about how to practice musically. And I want to sort of emphasize this is not a book about banjo. This is a book about playing any musical instrument. In fact, it's a book about learning anything, really, but specifically sort of related to music in this instance. And I thought it would be useful for people to understand a little bit of the context and sort of how you came to write the book.
Yeah, sure. So in some ways, the book was a lifetime in the making because it combines a lot of ideas and interests that I've had for a very long time. And I'll try not to go back to the day I was born. But kind of growing up, I think if I look back, I always loved the learning process. Back then it was kind of applied to sports, although I had an interest in music, but I just sort of didn't have the means to fully develop that back then, but I did a little bit of dabbling. But I loved the process of just getting better at things. And even back then, I felt like, to me, it seemed that how much better I got at something was directly proportional to the amount of effort I put into it, and how the type of effort too. But whether it's sports or music or all sorts of things in human life, the conventional narrative, at least then, was primarily around innate abilities or talent. You were good at baseball because you were born good at baseball, or you, especially around music, you were either musical or you weren't musical, and that always kind of bothered me because it didn't seem like that was true, and so that probably, I think, planted a seed early on for what turned into Brainjo. And as I got older, I got into, did my undergraduate degree in neuroscience, and then went on to medical school, trained in neurology. And there, I had a particular interest in neuroplasticity, or the science of how the brain changes, and that kind of gets wrapped up into the ideas, I think, around innate abilities and talents, and sort of there's the world of neuroscience for quite some time, especially in the beginning of the 20th century. The idea around the brain was that it was pretty fixed once we became adults, and I think in some ways that fueled the fixed mindset, or the idea that kind of you had these innate abilities that manifest in childhood, and then by the time you're grown, you have what you have, and there's not a lot you can do about it. And that was essentially overturned mid to late 20th century, and then there's a whole emerging science around how the brain changes and so forth. So as I started getting into music, I realized that, this sort of science of how the brain changes had not been really integrated into how people go about learning music, or really in much of education at all, even though the primary purpose of learning music or learning anything is to change the brain. We have to, what we're trying to do is build the neural networks that support the knowledge and skills of whatever it is we're trying to learn. So that, as I'm sort of doing that in a professional capacity, realizing that these things, these insights from neuroscience have direct applicability to learning and learning music. And then one of the great things about music is it's a very feedback-rich environment. So you can really test these sorts of things easily. The pace of change, especially early on, is quick. You get instant feedback about how you're doing because you can hear it. So it's a really good way of testing all of these things and getting better about the process of learning. And part of my frustrations as I was trying to learn music, so I started getting really into it early on, and my early 20s, I would say. And but there was plenty of information about what you should learn, but hardly anything about how to learn it, or the learning process itself. So it seemed to me there was a need to integrate this the science of how the brain learns into instructional methods. And like you said, it applies to anything. Music is a great testing ground for it, but this is really, these principles, are the same no matter what it is you're trying to learn. So, it was this fundamental belief that went way back, that, our success in learning anything is not about the brain we're born with, but the brain we make through practice. And so it's more about how we go about learning, and that success or failure is driven by our learning process, and that people who reach the high levels of expertise don't get there because of natural talent, but because of their very effective learning or practice methods. So we have these two streams of information that we can look to. One is the science of how the brain changes. The other is studying people who have reached high levels of expertise, see what their processes are. And those areas of overlap where you see commonalities between those two things, the theoretical side of neuroscience, the empirical side of people who have learned really well. And those to me are the best candidates for your golden principles about how to learn, and finding those golden principles and then building an instructional method around it kind of became the founding vision of Brainjo.
I know what I love about the book is that, with all the sort of scientific weight behind it and all the sort of study of process, it boils down to some proper, like, practical, applicable stuff that you can go and do and see the difference. And I think that's one of the brilliant things about it. There's so many books you can read and go, that was amazing, but I've no idea how to apply it.
Right.
By the time you've read the book, it's already told you how to apply it. And that's
right.
Fantastic.
I appreciate that. Yeah, it was important to me. It's always been important to be able to not just take, a lot of things that are scientifically oriented may focus a lot on the science or the theory, but you still are left there's a gap between how do I take that and apply that. And that's what I love to do. I mean, that's kind of the niche I've fallen into, in my professional life now, is figuring out how to take those things that are oftentimes walled off in the ivory towers of academia or whatever, and see and apply them to, help people make their lives better in some way.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's a lovely sort of image as well, this idea that, because I think it's easy for people to believe that some people are just born to, and obviously people are born with talents and with gifts, but you cannot sustain a career of brilliance based just on that. And, when you see somebody doing something amazing, we tend not to go, they must have worked hard. We tend to go,
right,
aren't they gifted? Like it's something that's been given to them, and they just sort of wander around showing it off to people. And I think it's great to have that challenged. It's a bit of a double-edged sword because that puts the responsibility on us to do something. The idea that we all have a brain that can be molded and trained and shaped and taught to do things means we can't sit around going, well, I just wasn't born that good. It's like, right. Well, find those limits. You've got some limits, but you'll never know what they are until you find them. So we'll be right back with you just after this. Bluegrass Jam Along is proud to be sponsored by Collins Guitars and Mandolins. If you're attending the NAMM show in January, stop by the Collings booth to say hello to the team, get hands-on with their selection of customised acoustics and electrics, and check out some exciting new prototypes they're working on for 2024. They'll also have a few of their world-class artists on hand demoing various instruments. And if you can't attend, don't forget to follow their Instagram and Facebook accounts throughout the show for photos, videos, and the latest news. Collings guitars are hand-built from the Sound Up in Austin, Texas. This episode is also brought to you by Peghead Nation, the home of roots music instruction. If one of your 2024 resolutions is to improve as a musician, Peghead Nation is the place to go. They have 65 streaming video courses for guitar, mandolin, banjo, fiddle, dobro, bass and ukulele from some of the leading names in acoustic music. Courses cover bluegrass, old time, Irish music and swing, plus lessons dedicated to improvisation, theory and ear training. Your first course is just $20 a month and you can add more for $10. Try any course free for a month with the promo code JAMALONG. Make 2024 a year of more music at pegheadnation.com.
Yeah, so it does, right. It does put sort of the responsibility back onto us, but you know, and a lot of that comes back to in terms of how you see that, right? Do you see that as pressure or opportunity?
Exactly. Yeah, mindset, entirely down to mindset.
It does, and one thing I also is try to get people away from is judging themselves appropriately or not judging themselves at all if possible, and really just you can look at the gap between where you are now and where you want to be is this sort of insurmountable or enormous area. You can see that as a negative, or you can see those are how many opportunities to make progress and enjoy the process of learning. And it's almost viewed in that way. Music is the gift that keeps on giving because there's no end to it.
And there's a bit from the book that basically describes the process as it not being about an end goal, it being about continuous small improvements. And that's kind of life, isn't it? If we fixate on, I'll be happy when this happens or when that happens, or if you just find processes that make your life incrementally better every day and enjoy them sort of running, then that's sort of what happiness is on a day-to-day level, really. And it's really liberating. And I think that the thing that, for me, there's two phrases from the book, two sentences that I think just sort of summed it up for me as a kind of approach. And one is that humans get really, really good at stuff through hard work, not through some fortuitous genetic gift of talent. And that's the sort of the basic principle. But what the practical application is followed up with how you practice matters a whole lot more than how much you practice. And that's kind of the meat of this conversation, I guess, is it's entirely down to what you do to train your brain to do the things you want it to do. Right.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah. You can, it's quality over quantity in many ways. I mean, quantity helps, but it won't correct for poor quality. And I think the thing about the innate talent narrative has caused us kind of collectively to overlook just how important the process is, because you can always say, oh, if it's not successful, well, it wasn't in the cards or whatever, rather than, maybe I should reevaluate how I'm doing this. And we haven't used those opportunities to learn how to craft a better process.
So what's the sort of the first place people can generally start to get to grips with some of these ideas and to sort of understand how they can take control a little bit?
Yeah, so it's a big topic, but I think it's in the early stages of learning, especially music. It can be easy to be overwhelmed by where to go and what to do. And it can also be tempting to try to do too much, right? You go into it because you're a fan of player X or whatever, or a certain style of music, and you see that in its fully realized form. You see a player who has how many hours of not only practice but probably really good practice in their past, and so. It's fuel for motivation, but if that's the yardstick, then that can be demoralizing pretty quickly. So, part of it, I think, early on is about making sure you're breaking down the process into kind of the smallest learnable chunks, especially as you're sort of building those foundational skills. And I think that's for an early player, probably the most important concept is, you're building this sort of foundation of skills. And in the brain, what you're doing is building motor programs that control the movements of your limbs that will allow you to play your instrument. And there's some perils if we're trying to do too much too soon. And one of those would be trying to sort of learn multiple different techniques at the same time. And ideally, if you're wanting to learn, how to pick a string cleanly, you want to learn that kind of on its own, right? You don't want to learn that as you're trying to learn a chord, as you're trying to learn this song. You kind of want to build those things on their own first, so that they're nice, high quality. The problem that if you don't, doing multiple things at once makes it harder to provide the brain with the kind of the quality input that you want. And so it's sort of like the garbage in, garbage out, idea. Yeah. The brain will build neural networks based on the input you give it. So especially early on with those technical skills, wanting to provide it with good quality inputs. And so taking things, using the sort of smallest learnable thing you can, and then not being afraid to play things slow and easy from the start. Doing too much, going too fast, all of these things. Our brain's going to adapt to what we give it. So if we sort of play stuff that's beyond us too fast and we're sloppy and whatever, it will build sloppy neural networks. And it's a lot, as anybody knows who's tried to break a bad habit, it's much harder to break them than it is to form them right in the first place. So I think the thing to think about early on is, how do I form good playing habits? And the keys there is start simple and slow. And going slow in the beginning is how you go fast later on.
Yeah, and I think that can be a challenge for people, particularly in the world of bluegrass, which has sort of got a reputation for being fast, intricate music.
Right.
Try to start playing fast, intricate music, and not only is that really, really hard to do, but also you sacrifice all sorts of things like tone and quality of note production. And so, I think it's something that I think lots of musicians deal with in some form, but you can only play a piece as well as you can play the trickiest bit of that piece. And one of the lessons I applied first from your book was just the idea of that smallest chunk of, I was learning a tune called Daly's Reel, and I could play most of it pretty quickly, and one bit of it I could just get through quite slowly, but I was still practicing the whole piece from the beginning.
Right.
And then I just sat for 20 minutes several times over the course of a week, playing about 6 notes. That was it. Just playing this little bit, gradually driving everybody in the house mad. And by the end of the week, it was there. And I could have carried on playing the whole tune forever. And, I might have dragged that worst bit up by a few BPM, but I never would have got it to the level of the rest of it.
And that technique in particular you talk about is one really good illustration of why your process matters so much. Like you said, you could have spent your practice time practicing that whole song every time, right? So say it takes you 5 minutes to go through the song, and say the little piece that's tripping you up, you got all of it right, but just that 10 seconds worth, right? Yeah. And you spend 5 minutes, each time just to practice that 10 seconds, when you can just pull out that 10 seconds and think about how much, faster you're able to learn the piece just by focusing on what you need to. I refer to that particular technique as the labyrinth technique, because and that idea came to me. If you're familiar with the game Labyrinth, where people have seen it's got the wooden board and you move it around, you move a little marble around and try and get it through a maze. I was playing it with my son. He was like 7 or 8 at the time, and we were trying to see who could get it the furthest. And so I was practicing on my own time, and there was this one little spot in the maze that was like, way away from the start line, and I was putting my marble at the start and getting to that spot and then trying to get through it. And I kept putting back. I was like, wait a second, why don't I just put the marble right at the spot and work through the little movements I need to get through that. And I was like, and that's the same thing with music. It's like, if you have a little troublesome section in a piece or a song, work on that specifically, right? And in both cases, the learning will accelerate dramatically just by making that little switch. And it's one of those things that seems so obvious in retrospect. You're like, duh, why didn't I think of that? But you don't do it, and I'm still guilty sometimes of not thinking to do it. So it's these are. I mean, part of the reason I write these things down is to remind myself of what's most important.
And it's that also that sort of idea, and it's the same principle, I guess. But I sort of realised that I can play the A section of most fiddle tunes much better than I can play the B section because you start with the A section. And so I'll sometimes start a tune and I'll start with the B section and then go into it, and it makes so much sense when you see it from that angle.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and then also sometimes practicing like starting with the fourth measure. See if you can do that. Is the song like stored sequentially in your mind, so you have to start from the beginning like your ABCs, or can you go straight to a section and play it? It's another challenge, but how in a demonstration that how you learn really shapes what you end up having.
Yeah, and it leads into that idea of sort of the practical sense of how you get that feedback and how you understand if you've internalized something enough. And I'm going to pronounce this word wrong. Automaticity.
Yeah,
I stumble up with auto, but this idea that I loved it. That it's sort of very simple idea that if you can do something while you're doing something else, it means that you're able to do it with a level of autopilot. And the something else that you describe is something that musicians do all the time anyway, which is playing along to a metronome. Mm-hmm. And it's so simple.
Yeah. So, and I think probably another thing for people early on to think about, and I think there's a tendency when people are starting out not to practice along with any type of rhythm keeping device or timekeeping device. And we think of the metronome or any kind of timekeeper as a way of practicing rhythm. But it's also a way of testing for automaticity, and automaticity meaning you can carry out some type of activity, some kind of motor program with your limbs or whatever, while your conscious mind is focused on something else. And really what we want to do is take all of the technical components of playing and automate them, right? So, when you're playing with others or when you're performing, you want your conscious mind not to be able to have to focus on any of the movements of your hand. And as you're learning, we talked about breaking things into the smallest chunk. One way to know that you have that chunk, that you've successfully learned it, is if you're able to play it along with some kind of external timekeeping device. Because what you have to do in that scenario is your conscious mind has to pay attention to the clicks or the drum beat or whatever while your hands are doing something else. So, if you're not able to keep up, it could mean that you need to work on your rhythm, but it also could mean that those movements just aren't automated yet. And so your conscious mind can't focus on both the movements you're making and listening to the thing that's keeping time. So yeah, it's a super important thing to use early on. I mean, I think if you're talking about good New Year's resolutions, always practicing with some kind of timekeeping device is a really good one, because it's something that I know a lot of people avoid, and it's one of those things that if you start out not using it all and then try to go back, it makes it even harder.
Yeah, and I noticed this in my playing, just doing that. You sort of get double feedback. You get the feedback on whether you've managed to automate the process or not, but you also get feedback on which of the bits of the tune you struggle with most, because they're the bits where you're struggling to keep up. And I hear my son play the piano, and he doesn't like to practice with the metronome because he likes to be able to slow down for the tricky bits.
Right.
And you can't do that with a metronome. And it's
right. And you may not realize you're doing that until you put that track on and hear it. Yeah, it's like truth serum. You'll find out. And then you can actually, it's a good process is to take something you think play it along with the backing track, and then you find little bits where you're slowing down or not able to keep up. And then those are the ones that then go back, use the labyrinth technique to and just loop those, with a backing track. And that's a really effective way to learn, much more effective way to learn than not using one at all.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it is. You sort of talked earlier about the sort of speed of particularly in the early bit of learning an instrument, you get a lot of progress really quickly, but that sort of sense of frustration, and I think you put it really sort of clearly actually, that most people give up because they stop getting better. They don't give up because they have no desire to play the instrument anymore. They don't give up because they and it may be that they've got time constraints and they don't have as much time to play as they used to, but that means if you're the kind of player that gets your guitar out and sits and noodles around the things for an hour and then puts it away again, you're not going to get any better. And then if that time you've got drops to 10, 15 minutes a day, you're never going to improve. And so I think that's a really sort of clear call, is that constant improvement is one of the ways to keep yourself engaged and motivated, and that can be incremental, small improvement. It's not earth-shattering stuff every week. It's just little bits of being a little bit better than you were last week.
Yeah, I mean that was one of the things I wrote about in the book, was that I had my own personal revelation when I realized that I enjoyed playing as much now as I did just in the very beginning. Like it wasn't reaching some particular level or being able to play some particular song. It was simply just the process of learning and getting better and making some kind of incremental progress. So on the one, and part of that is to kind of help people reframe from thinking, if I make it here one day, then I'll be satisfied with my playing, because that's not going to happen. You will once you get there, you're going to be saying, "Oh, there's plenty more to learn." But by the same token, it means that your enjoyment is not going to change. It's here and now, right? And it's really about progress, and then like you said, finding the smallest amount of progress. It really doesn't matter. When you make that leap from something you couldn't do to something you can, it's just as enjoyable. And it's like that the whole way. It doesn't really matter how sort of the absolute level of difficulty of whatever it is. It's more about that you can do something today that you couldn't do yesterday. Just addictive.
And what I love about it is not only do you get that constant bit of progress, or if you don't, you're never far from being able to get the process back on the tracks and do it. But you also do get those moments where, or I certainly do, where I'm sitting there and it suddenly feels like I've had a breakthrough, even though all I've been doing is a little bit of work every day. I suddenly sit there, sort of maybe recording a backing track for the podcast, and I'm just sort of watching my hands go and thinking, I'm not really thinking about this. This is just coming out, and I'm listening to the quality of it rather than hoping I get to the end without getting it wrong. And that's. You do still get, you don't lose those moments of breakthrough just because it's incremental. Right.
Yeah. And those are, I love those. Those are the best, is when you feel like someone else is taken over.
Yeah.
But I mean, and it's, people describe that as I talk about, I think, some people may be familiar with the concept of flow, but it's this state where you're engaged in some kind of your focus is intent on something, and you're sort of doing it at a level, and your conscious mind is sort of not in the process, and it feels amazing. And really, the root of that is automaticity, is being able to automate all these things, and then you're just kind of sitting back, and it almost feels like you're not even there, you're not even doing it, but it's so much fun. And like you said, you can keep doing it because there's always more that you can do, and so you can keep having that experience over and over again. But it's part of the fun, I think.
Yeah, I was at a pub the other week playing at a session, and the session had finished and people were packing their instruments away, and I was sat chatting to one guy, and I was just playing a fiddle tune as we were talking, kind of. And somebody said, how can you do that and talk at the same time? And I said, well, practice, basically. I've played this tune enough that I don't have to think about it.
Right. The part of my brain playing this tune is not the part that talks to you. So.
Exactly. And if the part of my brain that had to focus really hard on playing that tune had to do that, then I wouldn't make any sense when I talk to you.
Exactly.
But I think what you just said there about the sort of the idea that if you reach the point where you go, I'm going to be happy when I get to there, there's always still somewhere else. And it's that, I think it's another of the lovely ideas from the book, is that it's just a journey, and it's we're all different. And it's a theme that's really emerged as I've talked to musicians on this podcast. It's easy, and I've said this before, but it's easy to get the idea that the best players in the world, like Bryan Sutton, for example, have arrived and are enjoying the view, but they're not. They're just going, great, here we are. All right, what's next? And there's always something. The really driven musicians you speak to only ever see what's next. They're not looking back and going, what can I do? They're going, what can't I do? What's next?
That's right. Yeah. And that's why music is so wonderful. If you actually had arrived, you get bored. Like we love novelty and we love progress. And if you got to a point where you're like, there's nothing left, well, you'd move on to something else. And the fact that music, there's no end to it, is, part of the appeal. And so it's great to the sooner you recognize that, the better, because it sort of takes away a lot of the frustrations that you might otherwise have if you have that idea in mind.
And I think the other thing that goes along with that, maybe that sort of goes hand in hand with it a bit, is you talk about children learning to walk in the book, and how they don't fall over and get disheartened and decide they're never going to walk again. They just get up, have another go, fall over again, get up, have another go. But as adults, we sort of lose the willingness to fall over. So I think there's a thing that we have as adults that kids don't have, and kids aren't embarrassed because there's no guilt or shame in getting something wrong. And we feel that more acutely as we get older, and it's hard to dislodge that. But actually, the idea that there is no failure, just feedback, is incredibly powerful and yet difficult to fully commit to for people who.
Yeah. The older, exactly. Like we're, kids are designed to be learning machines. So, to learn, you fail. And that's how you get, like you said, if there's no failure, only feedback, you have to get feedback to know how you're doing. And so when you make a mistake, that's just an opportunity to learn. And our brains know that. But we do get, the older we get, the more judgmental we tend to be on ourselves. I think the other thing, that happens, which I talked about, is that the older we get, we also become accustomed to feeling masterful in more areas of our life. Whereas, as kids, we're learning everything. We're not experts at anything yet. So when you're used to kind of feeling expert, at your work or whatever, or if you can get through your entire day on autopilot, and then, you encounter some endeavor where you feel like a total beginner, you may resist that because, you're not used to that anymore. Whereas as a child, you're used to that all the time. But, so trying to reframe that experience is part of the mindsets, that are necessary to be successful, and reframing how you think about failure, no failure, only feedback. The other concept that I like is going back to sort of childhood development, and is the idea of the timeline of mastery, and meaning that there's no good, bad, whatever. It's just, where are you on the timeline, right? Mm-hmm. Just like any child, a 2-year-old's going to be at a different place than a 4-year-old and learning to talk, right? But they're, you wouldn't expect them to be at the same place, and that if they're continue to work on it, they're going to keep making progress. So it's not really about what particular level you are, only where are you now, and kind of what's the next step to move you on the timeline. And we're all just at different spots on the timeline,
and I think that's, like, in my experience anyway, something that, like, you accept in loads of other areas of life. I have a friend who's one of the most intelligent, eloquent, able to express themselves people that I know, but apparently didn't start talking till he was, nearly 5. You wouldn't know it, and And that sense that you should be at a certain point at a certain stage in your life, it's like that they're just averages, and it's sort of, it brings me on to the idea you talk about. There is this common idea about 10,000 hours of something to master it, and on one hand, that's a lot of time, but but the sort of point you make is that 10,000 hours of what? If it's 10,000 hours of just playing Whiskey Before Breakfast again.
Right.
Like, the 10,000 hours of that isn't going to get you anywhere beyond being able to play Whiskey for Breakfast really, really, really well.
Right.
But if there's things you do that are sort of meaningful, you can not only shave down those numbers of hours, but see the progress happen. And I think one of the key questions that I found really interesting in the book, and that I presume most people listening to this are going to be interested in, is the idea of how much we should actually be practicing. Because you listen to some musicians who practice 3, 4, 5 hours a day, and that's great. But I don't have that time available to me. But I don't want that to be the reason that I don't want to sit there going, well, I haven't got 4 hours to practice, so I can't get any better, because I know that's not true. And I know you've got some very definite ideas on this. Yeah.
So the good news is, so you're right. It's easy to see, hear a story about player X practicing 8 hours a day and thinking, well, that's what it takes. Forget it. But it's important not to mistake like seeing that for that being the way it has to be. Right. Just because someone practices that much doesn't mean you need to practice that much to get there. So it's more of a question of, what is, like I said, it all goes back to, this is ultimately about changing our brain. So, what is necessary to do that? And so the good news there is that your initial efforts provide a disproportionate amount of your returns for any practice session. So there are limits to, if we go back to thinking about this is about changing the brain. So if I want, my goal of my practice is to signal my brain that I want it to change to support learning this new thing that I'm working on. There is a limit to how much it can actually do in the span of the day. It is a biological organ. It can't just, there's only so much reorganization it can do. It takes energy. And so what we want to accomplish is send it the signal needed to actually do that. So how much time is necessary for that? And then at what point are we sort of facing diminishing returns? And is there actually a point where we might be doing too much, where we might undermine what we're wanting to do? And there's, would love to have even more research than we have on this topic. But based on what we know, you can stimulate the brain to change in about 20 to 25 minutes of practice time, or in experimental protocols of various things that have been done to stimulate neuroplasticity. That looks to be what's necessary. And that also dovetails with research on attention, where the amount of time we can generally pay close attention to something without fatiguing and without degrading the quality of our practice or whatever is about 20 to 25 minutes. So I think that is a great target for most everybody, particularly when we're talking about, stuff where we're trying to stimulate the brain to do something that it can't do today, today to do it tomorrow. Right. And a lot of that has to do with a lot of the technical components of playing. And the reason the attention piece is important is that the way, our brain doesn't change in response to everything, right? You can't remember what you had for breakfast 4 days ago, or whatever. These are and that's a feature, not a bug. You don't want to remember everything. You don't want your brain to waste energy and resources, remembering things that are trivial. So most of the stuff it takes in, from our sensory organs, it forgets on purpose. So we have to have some mechanism for saying, don't forget this thing. This thing's important. I want you to change and be better at this tomorrow. And attention is the way we do that. When we pay close attention to something, that gives our brain the signal that, hey, this thing is important. We're going to devote energy tonight while you're sleeping to try to make a network to get us a little bit better at this tomorrow. So you want to be able to pay focused attention on something to stimulate it to change. And then, like we talked about earlier, it will change based on the inputs you give it. So you want to give it high quality inputs. So if your attention is starting to fade, if those inputs are no longer, as high quality, that's the time to stop. So that's where the 20 to 25 minute kind of guideline comes from. And then, if you want, if we're talking sort of about the technical components of playing, and I'm skeptical that doing much beyond that would be beneficial, just because of the limitations of biology and how much we can change. There's also a phenomenon known as motor interference, where if you practice something and then you practice something else within 4 hours of that, both of those things will be degraded. So your performance on either one will be worse than if you hadn't done the second one. So you could potentially undermine your progress either by going too long or by doing another session in close proximity. So that's where I've recommended before, if you're going to do another practice session in a day, give yourself at least 4 hours or more. Particularly if it's these technical components. Now, one of the thing that's sort of a caveat to think about is that there's more to playing than just learning the movements that we need to make, right? There's
sure.
The other category, there's training your ear, right? And there's learning all how music works, what people would call music theory, which tend to get neglected. But one of the principles of interference is that it probably matters how much the networks overlap. So if you're learning one particular thing and it's totally discrete from another, it's a lot less likely for there to be interference. So, rather than say practice for 20 to 25 minutes on learning this passage in this, in this particular piece that you're struggling with, and then don't do anything else, rather you could say do that and then maybe do something to train your ear or do something, to learn more about theory that you don't know or whatever. So it's, understanding the type of learning also matters in terms of how you're partitioning your practice time.
And again, I think it's one of those things that these aren't concepts we don't understand. If you've been to the gym, you need to let your body, this is the thing that I think I found really interesting, is the idea that you're not getting better while you're practicing. Mm-hmm. You're telling your brain how to change while you're practicing, and then after you practice, your brain, and it's the same with your muscles when you exercise. You tear your muscles ever so slightly, and as they mend themselves, they get stronger. And exactly that point, I guess, is that you wouldn't physically expect that if going to the gym for half an hour every day was good, that going to the gym for 3 hours every day would be proportionally better for you. And a fine example of that is I've been running for years to keep fit, and I decided to run a marathon a few years ago, and what I learned was that I'm capable of doing it, but it's not very good for me.
Yeah, right.
If the only goal for that is a distance goal, then that's a challenge, and I accepted the challenge and I enjoyed it. It was great. But my body did not turn around and go, "Thanks for doing that. That was brilliant." Right. My body turned around and went, "What are you doing? You don't need to do that to keep fit. That's not, and it's a different kind of challenge, and it's, but the principle is definitely there, that more of something is not always better than the right amount of something.
Yeah, we're very inclined to think more is more, and it's definitely not always true. And you're right. The analogy to sort of muscular fitness or whatever is a really good one. It's the same kind of idea. You wouldn't, you spending 20 minutes or 30 minutes in the gym to sing the signal is great. If you spend 3 hours doing the same thing, you're probably going to undermine yourself because you're going to have no ability to recover from what you just did. So. And I think, there's a lot of different domains in biology where you're learning that less is more, right? And how to get away, what is sort of the minimum effective dose and how can you do it the most efficiently?
Yeah. And there's a couple of things you touched on there, actually, both the concept of giving your brain time to rest so it can build these new pathways. Mm-hmm. But also the sort of the stuff you can practice that isn't just the mechanical move, and some of it doesn't even require an instrument being in front of you. And so it leads me on to the idea of visualization, which is something you talk about a lot in the book. And I think this is something that when Bryan Sutton was recommending this book, he'd sort of said that he'd use these visualization techniques to learn the music for the new Bela Fleck tour that he's playing on. And this is some complicated music.
Right, sure.
Complicated music, and it's really helped. And first off, I think the word visualization has been unhelpfully co-opted in some circles around personal development, because it's sort of on some sort of crass level, visualization means if you want a really nice car, just think about yourself having a nice car and eventually you'll get it.
Right.
And A, that doesn't work. But B, I think it's a bit of a simplification of what visualization is. And I mean, I'll let you explain it because you'll explain it better than I do, but it's much more about actually mentally going through a process rather than just painting a nice picture and looking at it. Right.
Yeah, exactly. So if you use the term visualization, there's no telling what somebody's going to think of because of the different ways of it to use. But in this particular context, and it's like you said, it's a really effective tool. But what we're talking about is a first-person perspective of playing. If you're a musician and using visualization, a first-person perspective of playing your instrument. And I usually have people as an exercise to kind of get the idea or know if they're doing it right is to either imagine throwing a ball with your non-dominant hand and just sort of not imagining watching yourself, but actually doing that, making the throw, first doing it with your dominant hand, then doing it with your non-dominant, or try imagining signing your name with your dominant versus your non-dominant. And if you do that, and if you feel the awkwardness of doing it with your non-dominant hand, then you've got the right idea. Then you're doing the first person perspective.
Yeah.
And and studies on this show that if you image your brain doing this, the same networks that are lighting up, that are with increased blood flow, when you're actually doing the thing, are lighting up as well when you're visualizing the thing. And even more remarkable is that if it's done in some kind of learning paradigm, so there was one that was a simple little piano piece taught to novice piano players, and one group visualized and one group just played the piece and one group didn't practice at all. And the group that visualized over the intervening period of time at a certain interval did just as well as the group that practiced the actual piece. So not only does visualization activate the same areas of the brain as doing the thing, but it also can stimulate neuroplasticity in the same way. So you can just think about something and cause the brain to change, which is just amazing. I still think it's amazing.
Yeah. And I think, it's incredible, isn't it? It's that idea that if you think there's a tiger behind you, that's just as frightening, whether there is or there isn't.
Right.
Yeah. Your brain treats it as the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a super useful technique. It's a way to practice when you don't have an instrument with you. Another thing that's great about it is that one of the issues that banjo players have is in trying to get away from written notation or tab or something like that. And, with tab, you can play by sort of taking what you see on the page and translate that to movement of your hands, right? If you are visualizing and you're not using anything written, what you're having to do is take your imagination of the actual music and map that onto movements of the hand. And those are the kinds of networks, those networks that map sounds onto movements, is the kind of thing you're wanting to build. So it's a way of working on that particular skill, or building that particular skill of sort of ear development in a way that physical practice can't actually do, or unless you're deliberately doing it. So it's also a really good way to sort of build your ear and build your ability to connect sounds that you're hearing in your mind to movements that you're making of your limbs. And one thing I mentioned in the book is a nice kind of habit to get into is, if there's something that you were working on during the day, is as you're going to bed at night, if there was like a 6-note passage or whatever that you rehearse multiple times, go visualize that thing at night. And just like the example of, throwing with your non-dominant hand or signing your name, you'll feel, if it's something that feels is not, you don't have it down yet, you'll feel that same level of awkwardness as you're visualizing it. So you can practice it in the exact same way, and you can, just like you do in real life, slow it down in your mind, loop it over, But one nice thing about doing it right before bed is there's evidence that when the brain's sort of deciding what to change for, what memories to store at nighttime, which is part of the reason why we sleep, it tends to prioritize things that happen closer to the sleep interval. So it's a way of signaling, hey, this is this thing I really want you to work on tonight. And it may help you fall asleep.
Well, yeah, and as a double whammy, it sort of, helps distract you from lying there thinking about not being asleep yet.
Exactly.
It's great. Yeah. And it also that idea, with just and in all respects, our approach to sort of mental health in all its facets is behind our approach to physical health, but they seem so aligned in many ways. And the idea that, if you want to improve an instrument, one thing that you're going to need is sleep. So your brain can mend all those things and build all the new pathways. And, in the way that your body needs sleep, your brain needs sleep. Every bit as, the more research is done, the more sleep seems to be a really key part of life.
And I think that speaks to another really important thing that's often overlooked, is the fact that if this is all about changing our brain. Our brain is a biological system, right? So its health is going to be a primary driver of the results that we get and how effective we are. And sleep is a great example of that, because we know that sleep is essential for learning. That's when, whether it's your muscles or your brain, that's when we repair and recover. We don't learn when we're practicing. We learn when we're sleeping. That's the time the brain devotes resources towards building new stuff. So if you're not getting it, or if you're not getting certain stages of sleep, then you may not. That could undermine your whole, all your efforts. So being mindful of the fact that we're ultimately, requiring something of a biological system here, that its health matters. So attending to things like making sure we're getting adequate sleep, sleep, movement, nutrition, probably being the three big things that drive the health of the brain. But those things are going to influence this process probably significantly and more than than most people appreciate. And it's easy to, because all of our learning sort of happens in an abstract space. We tend to forget that it's all driven by a biological system.
Yeah, and even simple things like life is incredibly busy now, but I just find that we've lost that time that we used to just sit and look out the window. And for me, it's like in the same way that when you're practicing an instrument, it's not when your brain's actually making the changes. When you're reading a book or taking some information in, it's not when you're processing it. That happens when you're going for a walk or doing the dishes or driving the car or just sitting and looking out the window. And that's when, your brain puts everything where it needs to go so you can use it effectively.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We are seemingly busier than ever, and we've tended to undervalue the importance of sleep and undervalue the importance of downtime. Whether it's going for a walk, whether it's I know that all of my best ideas and insights come when I'm not thinking about something. When I'm on a walk, when I'm in the shower, when I'm on a drive, when I'm daydreaming out. That's when your brain is assimilating information, and it needs those downtimes, right? We can't always be bombarding it, but in this day and age, that's become more of an issue than ever.
I was talking to my son about it the other day, and sort of explaining to him I was at university. We had 2 recording studios that you could book 24 hours a day, and you could record through the night, and we often did. But every Monday morning for 3 hours, they were both offline while the technicians went in and cleaned things and sorted the cables out and sorted out the tape heads and we were livid about that because that's 3 hours we can't those studios. And they just said to us, look, if we don't do this every week, you're not going to get to use them at all because they'll just fall apart. And it is that sort of the idea of scheduled downtime, scheduled maintenance and just looking after the things themselves that I think people. I think maybe the last couple of years have hopefully taught people a bit more about that and reminded us that we need that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that I bet most people listening have had the experience, and we've kind of touched about it earlier, where you haven't played for a little bit, or you've slept, and you come back and it's easier than it was the day before, right? And it's a powerful illustration that something happened while you weren't doing anything. And so the idea that things can happen while you're not directly working on them. I mean, most of our brain is like that, right? Most of our brain, what it's doing, it's learning when we're not deliberately, sitting down to learn something. It's always learning. It's always running in the background.
So maybe we should be thinking about these, a bit like writing a piece of music. Like you write the piece of music and the act's enjoyable, but then when the royalties come in later down, you're not still writing the music or performing it. The royalties
That's right.
It's like
That's right. That's right.
Is royalties.
Yep. Right. Progress is royalties. That's like good. Yep. It's a payoff for the effort that you put in before.
Yeah. Exactly. And so the thing I think, like maybe. We sort of started off talking about this being a Christmas, New Year kind of resolution thing. And I wonder if the one thing that I took away from the book, I mean, I took so many things away, it would take more than an hour for us to talk about all of them. But it's just that idea about, and I can't remember exactly how you phrase it now, but it's don't practice harder, practice better, or smart. It was smarter, wasn't it? Don't practice harder, practice smarter. And I think that would be a great New Year's resolution for anybody learning and doing anything, but don't just to be mindful about the time you spend on it, particularly if you're short on time to spend on it. Take quality time, do the stuff, buy the book, apply the lessons.
Yeah. So, I started learning the banjo when I was in my medical internship, and that was a time I was working 90 hours a week. And it was only because it had just been mandated. Otherwise, it'd been even more than that. So I had, very little practice time, right? I had to figure out how to do this with very little. So if I wasn't practicing smart, I wasn't going to get very far. But it's become abundantly clear that quality, is so important, and you can make so much more progress by practicing smarter than you probably think is possible. Like I said, if you can actually commit to 20 to 25 minutes of good quality practice most days, you're going to be blown away by where you are in 2 or 3 years, So yeah, committing. So, and I think it ultimately gets back to recognizing or acknowledging that it ultimately is about the process. Right. If you understand that really what matters, it's not the brain you have, not whatever innate abilities you were born with, but rather how you actually go about practicing something, and then understanding the golden principles there, which is kind of the mission of Brainjo to begin with. That focusing on understanding those principles probably is more important than anything else you could do. And then figuring out how you're going to implement those in a way that makes sense for you. I think that would be a great way to start the new year.
Yeah, and there's so many simple lessons in the book that, despite the sort of length of research and complexity of science behind it, they're not. There's nothing that somebody could read the book. You could take six things away from it, implement those, and you would be an infinitely better player in 6 months' time. Yeah, and there's so much practical stuff there. It's great. I loved it.
Well, great. That's great to hear.
I'll stick a link in the show notes to the book. And where's the best place for me to send people to get more information on Brainjo?
You can send them to the Brainjo Academy. It's brainjo.academy. I'm in the process of moving everything there. But that's the best place for like central headquarters.
Great. Brilliant. I'll stick some stuff in the show notes. Is there anything else you want to cover while we're here?
I don't think so. That was good. I appreciate. It's always so nice to be interviewed by someone who's like read stuff, and those are great questions. It makes for such a better interview.
I mean, this is something I do in addition to my day job and in addition to finding time to play music as well. So all the time I spend podcasting is time not spent playing the guitar. So I'm not going to interview anybody if I haven't read their book and loved it.
That's good. So you're a guitarist?
Yeah, guitar and mandolin, but I think lockdown brought me back to guitar. There's something about a bigger sound that fills a room that just and coming back, it felt a bit like coming home, picking up a guitar again. I can't quite explain it, but it's just, that's been what I've been doing for the past couple of years.
Very cool. Where are you?
Over in the UK. I live in London.
You're in London? Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Brilliant. Well, I can't thank you enough. This has been such an enjoyable conversation, and I think there's stuff in here that everybody can take away and run with.
All right. I appreciate it. I really appreciate you having me on.
Thanks a lot, Josh.
All right. Take care.
Cool. I really hope you enjoyed that. I thought it was just full of really interesting stuff. I really, really recommend you go and get Josh's book and read it and just start implementing some of this stuff yourself. I'll stick a link in the show notes to the book, so go and have a look, click through and have a look. That's it for Bluegrass Jam Along this year. End of our very first year. It's been a blast. I think we've on about 145 episodes now. Thanks to each and every one of you who's downloaded one, who's jammed along, listened to the interviews, who's been in touch on social media, sent me an email. It's been fantastic. I've had such a great time doing this. I've got some more really cool interviews lined up for you in January already. There'll be plenty more tunes on the podcast next year. In the meantime, have a happy new year and happy picking. Bluegrass Jam Along is proud to be sponsored by Collings Guitars and Mandolins, making some of the finest guitars and mandolins in the world since the 1970s. Visit collingsguitars.com and find out why.